A reversal of American concepts of otherness in the fiction of Sui Sin Far by Annette White Parks, published by the Oxford University Press on behalf of the Society for the Study of the Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States in 1995. In this article, White Parks iterates the ways in which Sui Sin Far, or Edith Eaton, defies the popular technique employed by ethnic writers of the late 19th century of mediation. This technique of writing, in a way that emphasizes the similarities of two ethnic groups rather than focusing on what makes them different, was used in order to convey to audience of this time period that those who were outcast and labeled as different due to the color of their skin or the shape of their eyes were not as different as perceived to be. White Parks asserts that there is a key part of mediation which Sui Sin Far's writing does not follow. She states that one critical aspect is the stance or attitude a writer assumes towards the cultures of and for whom she is writing. While other writers took the stance of writing for a certain audience and that audience only, following the traditional confines of inside or outsider perspectives, Sui Sin Far's stance varies. Though her stance varies and her characters don't exactly adhere to the stereotypes that had been developed of Chinese people as outsiders at this time, Sui Sin Far does over time take the role of a Chinese American, as we see in the story The Inferior Woman, through the main character of Mrs. Spring Fragrance, and in several of Sui Sin Far's other stories. At this time, other popular North American writers were also writing about Chinese Americans, but in ways that solidified the racist stereotypes of these people through the perspective of otherness. These authors were following suit of authors such as William Bradford from earlier in North American history. His writings from the colonial period of the United States reflected the philosophy of the present day, that North Americans of European descent were inherently more worthy of receiving the role of protagonist and insider, while those with darker skins were placed within the role of antagonist. This initial stance on story writing from the early 17th century became the basis of what was considered American literature for popular writers in Sui Sin Far's time. White Parks argues that these white protagonists are then allowed voices in stories, while outsiders remain silent and mysterious. In effect, they are robbed of the qualities that make them human, and the stereotypes they are based upon are solidified in the prose. Sui Sin Far recognizes this trend of popular writers to encourage these racist stereotypes in a letter to an editor in which she says, "I have read many clever and interesting Chinese stories written by American writers, but all seem to me to stand far off from the Chinaman, in most cases treating him as a joke." In stories that follow this protocol, such as The Third Circle, white protagonists venture into the seemingly mysterious and dangerous world of Chinatown, and the characters who they meet are often unsavory, tricking the protagonist. Along with this encouragement of stereotypes comes the same glorification of the description of these settings in stories like these. The stairs are always grimy, the curtains soiled, presenting Chinatown as a place to be feared itself. Unlike these stories, and unlike the popular North American writers of this time, Sui Sin Far's works do not hold the same quality of inhumanness for those characters that would be considered outsiders in society. Instead, White Parks argues that the alien celestial is a human being, and Far's writing is something novel to the late 19th century. In Sui Sin Far's stories, Chinese Americans take a central role. White Parks shows several examples of this within Far's stories, in which the main characters, who are Chinese American, are impeded by the inequality and laws of a country that preaches liberty and justice for all, but does not practice this sentiment. Thus, through their differences and the lack of mediation by Far, the stereotypes are revealed not only as shallow, but wrong. Within The Inferior Woman, there is evidence of this role reversal, White Park argues, when Mrs. Spring Fragrance desires to write a book about whites of Seattle for her Chinese friends because they are so mysterious, inscrutable, and incomprehensible. Words that would normally be used to describe women like Mrs. Spring Fragrance and others who fall into the minority of otherness. In this role reversal, White Parks argues that Sui Sin Far puts the audience within the shoes of the Chinese Americans, thus reversing the roles of familiar and unfamiliar. What is considered otherness is not the actions of the Chinese American protagonists, but the actions of the white and of European descent antagonists. Sui Sin Far puts us in the shoes of otherness itself, making what popular writers defined as normal seem far more different and strange. Before, the Chinamen were to be wary of, but through Sui Sin Far's radically different point of view, White Parks explains that it is now North Americans of European descent to be the ones to be feared and protected against. In conclusion, this is how Sui Sin Far was able to open the literary world to other perspectives of race and culture, and though her work was heavily critiqued for its lack of scholarly style and merit, most do not argue that she was one of the first writers of this time period to present Chinese and feminine culture to audiences in this way. Thanks for listening.